And one might say that she doesn't invoke seriously the complications of race and of class. That's all assumed to be abolished somehow. And indeed, which allows us to sort of move towards MacKinnon, she does not really examine the distinction between sexuality and gender. Between sexuality and gender. So, those are my 5 comments. Now, there may be other ransacking options that you would like to pursue. Are there any other thoughts about, yes, Matthew?
To Fanon, she, at least in the part we read, she doesn't talk about the urban role of diet. How that might make a difference for gender liberation.
Well, she actually, the real problem is we have read so little of this book, but there are parts where she talks about, which in the history part of the book, where she does talk about the situation of rural women as opposed to urban women. And she talks a lot about what it has meant to have the vote and to have access to the wage labour market in the urban areas, and also compares the situation of men and women in these two contexts. But she does make a lot of it in terms of, it's basically all denounced as different forms of male domination. I think the only people that escape this are the independent woman. And the independent woman being the woman, not the wage labourer female wage labour enters the labour market, but the woman who actually has able to exist in sort of the public sphere as an intellectual and as having some sort of material basis that she does not have to work on a day-to-day basis for. And of course, is not committed to, she was never a mother, right? So she's not bound into the imminence of motherhood. Yeah. So it's really everything else is more or less relegated to a notion of male domination. Yes, Neil.
She's writing this during World War II. Did she make any mention or classification of the kind of women that go into the factories when the men go off as being an authentic response or an inauthentic response? Like what happens like here? Because in World War II, all the guys left, all the women went into the factories. Did she comment on, what, is that not equality in the workplace? Is that some other phenomenon that she doesn't think?
Well, when women enter the workplace, in her analysis, and in its introduction and inclusion, but it's elaborated elsewhere in the book, women enter the workforce, stay subject to domination in the workforce and at home. So it's a double subordination. And I don't think that she would see fighting in the war is in any sense sort of an authentic response for men. I mean, she is not a proponent of war. She's quite a strong pacifist. So fighting in the war has for her no significance of authenticity. That's been trapped in the military apparatus. A soldier is almost a quintessential person who's trapped in imminence. Again, like Foucault or Weber.
But the women that go into the workplace to take their jobs, for her, is that just...
No, that's taking jobs in a capitalist society is not. She's also a Marxist, right? It's not a movement towards authenticity. And I say that for her, when she talks about women taking jobs in the labour force, it means that they're taking low-paid jobs and they have to simultaneously continue in their domestic chores. So it's a double subordination. Each reinforces the other. Yes, Jane?
I think she also pointed out how after the war the men came back home, came out of the jobs, and they had to take the jobs anyway.
BB, which of course happened. That's right. But France, I don't know what the story was. That's the story, and we know that happened here, yes. Yes, I assume this happened in France too. I don't know to what extent women were mobilized into the labor force in France during the war. But anyway, yes, that is absolutely right. Women, it's been documented quite well that, how when men demobilize, women have to leave the jobs that they had temporarily. Yeah. Yes, Greg?
She also talked about, she mentions a lot of, Freud, talks about the castration. Does she, in the other books, the other parts we get through, does she mention how if we shape the culture or allow women the unconscious also kind of changes as well?
Yeah, well, she talks a lot about the Oedipus complex and the relationship of boys to mothers and girls to their fathers has been reproduced by the character of the nuclear family. And so that is a very, very deep, in fact in the passage I just read out just a few minutes ago, it is this socialization we would call it, is a very, very deep, embodied, and continues for one's life. Yes, so I think that she recognizes, and that's why she devotes so much of the book to tracing the stages through which young girls go as they become adults, and the power of that socialization in their subsequent lives. So that's why she insists that the structure of the family has to be reorganized. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, very good. Now we're moving on to MacKinnon. Ah, yes. Catherine MacKinnon. Yes. Look, de Beauvoir is not referred to very frequently by MacKinnon, but MacKinnon, in a sense, could not have written what she wrote were it not for the writings of de Beauvoir or somebody of that character. De Beauvoir, as I said, laid the foundations of what we might call radical feminism today. Radical feminism that placed women at the center of analysis, women as objects of men, objectified by men, subjugated to men. In a sense, Beauvoir created the foundations of a new feminism associated with figures in this country such as Betty Friedan, Kate Millett, well I guess Juliet Mitchell is English, Adrian Rich, Gail Rubin, Nancy Chodorow in this department, if you want a sociologist, Nancy Chodorow, Kristen Luca, Arlie Hochschild, Anne Barry Thorne, and Rocha Reyes, another generation. These are feminists, more or less radical depending on who we choose, who who are the inheritors of Beauvoir. And MacKinnon, to my mind, and why I chose MacKinnon sort of represents a radical feminism that is also a radical critique of Marxism that is very continuous with the ideas of Beauvoir. But MacKinnon will insist that it is not impossible for women to actually form solidary groups. And it is through consciousness raising, a concept that she theorizes in this article, that she distinguishes herself very clearly from Beauvoir. Yeah. So, MacKinnon lives today. She wrote in the late 60s, 70s, very influenced by Marxism. She was an academic, political scientist at Yale. She's also a legal theorist, very much, as I say, an academic. And I think she's most famous in the world beyond academia for her work on sexual harassment, bringing the ideas of sexual harassment to public consciousness. And as you'll see from the article, she has a very strong position that the appropriation by men of women's sexuality, and we'll see what that means in a minute, the appropriation of sexuality underlies all relations in contemporary society. Underlies all relations, all social relations in contemporary society. Yes. So it's a strong, just as Marx would say that class sort of underlies all relations in contemporary society, a radical feminist such as MacKinnon centers the importance of sexuality and gender. And she will make a distinction between sexuality and gender. Indeed, gender is the product of sexual appropriation. So there is a distinction between gender, the fact that there are men and women around, that is produced through a process of sexual appropriation, as we will see. But as I was saying, she also was very much writing at a time when Marxism was very fashionable in academia, late 60s and 70s, perhaps a reflection of the social movements of the 1960s and 70s. And so she is very much infused with an engagement with Marxism. Marxism was the radical thought of the time. De Beauvoir herself, as I've said many times, was steeped in Marxism, and was not able to even distance herself from Marxism. But clearly MacKinnon, I think, was. And I believe that her criticism of Marxism is a very deep and profound one, which is particularly why I like to discuss her. Yes, okay. That is my little introduction to MacKinnon. Now, in this article, which is I think probably her most famous article, she starts out in a rather dramatic fashion, but I don't want to just at this moment start where she starts. I want to, which was I'll do have to do next time, but what I want to do very quickly now, and you should read it for yourselves, the early pages, where she talks about the relation between feminism and Marxism. She talks about the relationship between feminism and Marxism. And she makes three sets of statements. The first set of statements is the feminist critique of Marxism. What is the feminist critique of Marxism? Marxists don't take women seriously. They don't incorporate the analysis of gender domination into their analysis. For Marxists, women are attached to a class. They are reduced to their class position. And for Marxists, she says, it's impossible for Marxists even to imagine that there can be any gender solidarity across class. That there's anything that binds women from the dominant class to those in the subordinate class. And she quotes Rosa Luxemburg. A great passage, she says, "Parasites of parasites," that's women of the dominant class. "Parasites of parasites," this is Rosa Luxemburg, "parasites of parasites have nothing in common with slaves of slaves." That's the subordinate class. So women are seen in the Marxist framework, and she quotes Luxemburg deliberately as a Marxist. Women are seen to be the hangers-on of the dominant class, and they have nothing to do with the hangers-on of the subordinate class. We have to focus on class, say the Marxists. And so, obviously, feminists are very critical of this perspective, that there is something that women share across class. The other criticism of Marxism is that if you compare capitalists with state socialist societies, compare the United States with, for example, the Soviet Union, you don't see any, which Marxists are supposed to expect, you don't see any dramatic change and shift in the character of gender domination. That in both societies, state socialists, Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, in those countries, you still see gender domination much as you see gender domination in capitalist societies. Marxists would predict there will be a major difference in that. She says, no, there is no such difference, and we know that empirically that is true. That there is perhaps slightly different forms of gender domination, and for sociologists actually it turns out to be quite interestingly different forms of gender domination, but gender domination there is in both types of societies. Socialist societies do not seem to preclude male domination. So okay, that's the feminist critique of Marxism. Marxism really doesn't take gender seriously. It centers class, and on one hand, and Marxism has failed to sort of show that in fact different modes of production produce more or less gender domination. The second critique, Marxist critique of feminism. How do Marxists respond to feminism? Well, what does she say here? Well, she says that the Marxist critique of feminism, well, they don't recognize class. The class component of male domination is not recognized. Marxists say, you feminists, you're a liberal feminist, middle-class feminists, don't recognize class. That feminism as such is a middle-class project. It has a class foundation. That's what the Marxists say back to the feminists. That feminism is only for the privileged few. The feminism is not, in fact, such an urgent issue for the working class. So that's how the Marxists criticize feminism, but say, the Marxists are also critical of the feminists because the feminists, and this of course is very crucial, the feminists focus on the personal, on the emotional, on the micro, and they have no concept. So the Marxists have said, they have no understanding of the broader social structures within which gender domination takes place. Of course, those structures are indeed, according to the Marxist, class structures. So the critique of, this is MacKinnon talking, the critique of the Marxists and the feminists is that they focus on the micro, the emotional, the personal. They miss the macro. And so then there is a third position, the attempt at a synthesis. Marxism and feminism must work together. The dual systems approach, as it used to be called. And there was a very famous article written about, called The Unhappy Marriage of Marxism and Feminism. And indeed it is a very, very unhappy marriage. Yes. What essentially she says, no, that this dual systems approach, when Marxists try and include male domination, gender domination, they bring in notions of housework, they talk about the reproduction of the labor force, they perhaps talk about gender in the workplace, but it's always to what end? To understand how exploitation is intensified. It is brought into a Marxist framework, but really doesn't change the Marxist framework itself. And so she says that is a very unsatisfactory approach, and she argues that the feminists who try and bring in Marxism, they too suffer from the fact that they don't appreciate, and this is my last point before you all disappear, it's only 30 seconds past. Okay. The last point is that, and this is the crucial point for this article, is that Marxism and feminism can be brought together because they have different method. They have a different method. They are fundamentally at odds with one another because of the way they construct theory and because of the way they think about the theorist. This is at the core of this article. That you have to recognize, she says, the fundamental methodological differences between Marxism and feminism. And what that means we will talk about next time. Onwards. Please read the whole article for Thursday. That's me.
What did you say about the feminists trying to bring Marx in Marx? What's the criticism?
Yeah, you went over that very quickly. Well, essentially the criticism is that she's going to insist on that they don't recognize that feminism and Marxism have very different methods. And there's a great passage on page 239 you should read. I was going to read, I'll probably read it next time.
That clock is behind. You're 5 minutes over.
No, I'm not. Am I?
Yeah.
Really?
It's 3:34. The clock is behind.
2 minutes.
You set your watch after that clock. That's what people
2 minutes. Okay, all right. Thank you. Okay, Michael. Okay.
I thought you were talking about Victoria Steinem used to be the editor of Sassy magazine.